Garrett Pierce was already 28 minutes late to pick up his daughter when he spotted the silver sedan stalled on the
How
shoulder
is it
of
this
Route
morning?
17.
It's good!
Glad to
Hazard
hear it.
lights
Eat
blinked
up.
weakly
I
against
will.
the gray December sky, competing with the fading afternoon
Come in
light
out of the
that
cold. It's
barely
getting
reached
late.
through the
Thank
cloud
you. I
cover
appreciate
threatening
your
snow.
hospitality.
His phone buzzed for the sixth time. Mrs. Patterson from after school, care her patience wearing thin in the clipped messages he could read without looking. Ruby would be standing by the window with her backpack watching cars pull up that weren't his, trying not to look worried while the other kids got claimed one by one. The woman standing beside the open hood looked utterly lost, like someone who had never been lost before and possessed no framework for processing the experience. Her coat was cashmere expensive enough that Garrett recognized the quality even from 50 yards away, but far too thin for December in Ohio. Heels that belonged in a boardroom dug awkwardly into the gravel shoulder. Her phone hung dead in her hand, one more piece of technology that had betrayed her at the worst possible moment. Garrett's foot moved toward the gas pedal. He could drive past. Should drive past. Ruby was waiting, and Mrs. Patterson charged $5 for every minute after 6 o'clock money that would come straight out of the grocery budget. But his hands turned the wheel before his brain finished the calculation. Muscle memory overriding logic the way it always did when he saw someone in trouble. The white Ford crunched onto the shoulder 40 feet behind the sedan, and Garrett was already reaching for his toolbox before he'd fully shifted into park. The woman watched him approach with the wary confusion of someone recalibrating her understanding of how strangers behaved. Up close, she looked younger than her expensive clothes suggested, mid-40s maybe, with sharp eyes that probably missed nothing in a conference room, but seemed unable to process the simple fact of a dead engine on a country highway. Garrett stopped a respectful distance away. Toolbox in one hand, flashlight in the other. "Looks like you could use some help." Her shoulders released tension he hadn't realized she was holding. "The car just died. Everything." The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, then nothing. He moved to the front of the sedan, already scanning for obvious problems. Serpentine belt, most likely. These models had a reputation for it, especially once they hit 80,000 miles. "When's the last time you had it serviced?" She blinked at the question. "I don't know. Someone handles that." Garrett didn't comment. He'd learned years ago that some people lived in a world where cars simply worked until they didn't, where mechanical objects existed in a binary state of functional or broken with no middle ground requiring maintenance. He pulled the hood prop into place and aimed his flashlight into the engine compartment. 12 minutes later, he had the serpentine belt reconnected and the battery terminal cleaned of the corrosion that had been cutting power intermittently for weeks. The work was straightforward, the kind of repair he could perform in his sleep. The belt hadn't snapped, just slipped off its track, probably from the worn tensioner pulley he could see but didn't mention, because replacing it would require parts and time this woman clearly didn't have to spare. "Try it now." The engine turned over on the first attempt, settling into the smooth idle of a well-designed German motor. The woman climbed out, already reaching for the designer purse on her passenger seat. Fingers searching for her wallet with the automatic certainty of someone accustomed to solving problems with money. Garrett was walking back to his truck before she could extract whatever she intended to offer. He waved off her attempt to call after him, words he didn't quite catch, carried away by the wind picking up across the empty fields. His phone showed 6:43. Ruby had been waiting for 48 minutes. The drive to Millbrook Elementary took 19 minutes. Mrs. Patterson met him at the door with Ruby's hand already in hers, and an expression that communicated volumes about professional courtesy stretched past its breaking point. Ruby's face lit up when she saw him, but behind the smile he caught the flicker of worry she was too young to hide effectively. The question came before they'd cleared the parking lot. "Daddy, why did I have to wait so long?" Garrett's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Someone needed help on the road." Ruby absorbed this in silence, staring out the window at the familiar streets of Millbrook passing in the early winter darkness. Then, in that serious voice she'd developed somewhere around her 6th birthday, "But I needed you too." The words landed like a physical weight in Garrett's chest. He wanted to explain about obligations that extended beyond immediate family, about the kind of person he was trying to be, about setting examples and living with integrity. Instead, he just drove because 7-year-olds shouldn't have to navigate the moral complexity of competing needs, and because he wasn't sure himself whether he'd made the right choice. The house on Maple Street had belonged to his parents before the bank took most of what they'd left behind. His father had built the back porch with his own hands the summer Garrett turned 12, teaching him how to measure twice and cut once, how to level a foundation, how to drive a nail straight without bending it. Those lessons had become the foundation of everything Garrett knew about work, about patience, about doing things right even when no one was watching. His mother had planted the rose bushes that still bloomed every June, despite years of neglect, and the vegetable garden that Garrett still tended every spring, because he couldn't bear to let it go completely wild. When the foreclosure notice came 3 months after she passed the cancer taking, first her strength, then her voice. Finally, everything else. Garrett had been living in a 1-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, trying to convince himself that houses were just buildings, and buildings didn't matter. He'd failed spectacularly at that particular exercise in detachment. He bought the place back 6 years ago at a county auction the same month Natalie walked out and never returned. He'd paid $12,000 over the minimum bid because 2 other people wanted it, and he couldn't stand the thought of strangers sleeping in his childhood bedroom, walking on floors his father had sanded by hand. The porch still sagged on the east side where his father had miscalculated the support beams. The furnace wheezed through every winter like an old man climbing stairs, but the mortgage was his, and that meant something in a town where most folks rented from landlords who lived 3 states away and never fixed anything that could be ignored. Garrett ran a mobile repair service out of his truck, a white Ford with 210,000 miles on the odometer, and a toolbox bolted to the bed that contained more value than the vehicle itself. He'd bought the tools one at a time over 15 years, each wrench and socket, and diagnostic scanner, representing a job well done, a problem solved, a customer satisfied enough to recommend him to someone else. He fixed what people couldn't afford to take to dealerships, which in this part of Ohio meant he fixed almost everything. The work was inconsistent. Some weeks he cleared enough to put money aside for Ruby's college fund, a savings account that grew so slowly it barely kept pace with inflation, but grew nonetheless. Other weeks dinner came from the food pantry at St. Michael's, and he told Ruby they were helping the church use up donations before they expired. She pretended to believe him. They both pretended she believed him, and there was a kind of love in that mutual fiction. Ruby was 7 now, small for her age, but fierce in ways that surprised everyone who met her. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn silence, that particular quietness that came from watching more than speaking. She'd stopped asking about Natalie 2 years ago, around the same time she started making her own breakfast, so Garrett could leave early for jobs. She knew which bills sat in the kitchen drawer and which ones her father paid first. She knew the truck needed new tires before winter, and that new tires cost more than Christmas. She knew that sometimes her father sat at the kitchen table after she went to bed, staring at columns of numbers that never quite added up the way they should. She didn't know how to help with any of that, so she helped in the ways she could. She kept her room clean without being asked. She did her homework at the kitchen table while Garrett cooked dinner. She never complained about the generic cereal or the clothes from the thrift store that smelled like someone else's fabric softener, no matter how many times they went through the wash. It was too much understanding for a 7-year-old, but she carried it anyway, because that was what you did when you loved someone. That evening, after Ruby had finished her math homework and brushed her teeth and climbed into bed with the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 3, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The laptop was open to a tab he never closed, a web page for Ohio State's engineering program that he'd been accepted to 14 years ago with a full scholarship. He didn't know why he kept it open. Maybe as a reminder of roads not taken, or maybe as evidence that he'd once had potential beyond fixing alternators in grocery store parking lots. His phone buzzed. A text from a customer whose Honda needed brake work asking if Garrett could come by on Saturday. He typed back a confirmation calculated the job would take 3 hours, estimated his take after parts at around $200. Enough to cover groceries and put 20 toward Ruby's fund. Not enough to replace the tires, but the tires could wait another month if he drove carefully. He closed the laptop and finished the cold coffee. Tomorrow he had 4 jobs lined up: a transmission fluid change, a battery replacement, a check engine light that was probably just a loose gas cap, and a timing belt that absolutely needed to be done before it snapped and destroyed the entire engine. Honest work. Necessary work. Work that didn't require explaining why he'd given up a scholarship to stay in Millbrook and watch his mother die while his marriage disintegrated around him. 40 miles away, Diane Sutton sat in a penthouse that occupied the entire top floor of a building she owned. The Cleveland skyline stretched beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, a glittering testament to human ambition rendered in steel and glass and electric light. But she wasn't looking at it. She was staring at her ceiling, unable to sleep for the first time in years, replaying the same 12 minutes over and over in her mind. Diane had built Sutton Freight Systems from a single refrigerated truck her father left her when a heart attack took him at 53. She'd been 22 years old, and everyone told her to sell the truck and move on with her life. Find a nice corporate job with benefits and a 401k. Instead, she drove that truck herself for 3 years, learning every route between Cleveland and Chicago, every way a vehicle could break down at 3 in the morning on a deserted highway, every trick for maximizing payload while staying under weight limits. She negotiated with Teamsters who'd been in the business longer than she'd been alive. She met with senators and union bosses and investors who looked at her like she was a child playing dress-up in her father's old office. She'd fired executives who cried and hired others who thought they could outmaneuver her. She slept 5 hours a night because sleep was inefficient, and she woke every morning knowing exactly who she was and what she wanted. Now she owned 4,800 vehicles spanning 25 states. She employed 23,500 people. Forbes estimated her net worth at $4.8 billion, though the actual number fluctuated daily based on market conditions she could influence but never fully control. She had everything anyone could want and nothing that actually mattered. And she couldn't stop thinking about the mechanic on Route 17. She'd been driving herself a rare occurrence that her security team hated, and her assistant had learned to accept with resigned sighs. The meeting in Columbus had run 3 hours late because the acquisition target couldn't make a decision, and by the time she escaped her patients, worn to nothing by men who confused caution with wisdom, she was too wound up to sit in the back of a town car pretending to answer emails. She wanted silence, the kind of silence you could only find on a 2-hour stretch of empty highway in the middle of nowhere where no one could reach her and no one expected anything from her. Then the sedan died without warning, the dashboard lighting up with errors her engineering degree couldn't decode without diagnostic equipment. Her phone battery followed seconds later, killed by the 17 apps running in the background that her assistant insisted she needed for maximum productivity. She stood there in the cold, watching cars pass, and felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: helplessness. The complete absence of leverage. She couldn't buy her way out of this situation. She couldn't negotiate with a dead engine. The man in the white truck didn't slow down at first. She saw his brake lights flash, then release. Then they came on again, and he pulled to the shoulder, and a moment later he was walking toward her with a toolbox and a quiet competence that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times before. He didn't know her name, didn't recognize her face from the occasional business journal profile, didn't calculate net worth or social capital or what helping her might mean for his future opportunities. He just saw someone in trouble and stopped. She'd tried to pay him. He refused with a wave that dismissed the entire concept of transaction, said something about paying it forward that sounded sincere rather than performative, and walked back to his truck. He drove away before she could ask his name, before she could get his contact information, before she could process what had just happened. By midnight, she had his name, his address, and a summary of his life that fit on half a page. By 1 in the morning, she was parked outside his house in Millbrook, trying to understand why a man with so little would give his time to a stranger who clearly had so much. The house was small, well-maintained in a way that suggested someone cared despite limited resources. A single light burned in what looked like the kitchen. The white Ford sat in the driveway. Paint faded but body straight, a working vehicle rather than a status symbol. She sat in her sedan for 23 minutes, trying to convince herself to drive back to Cleveland that showing up at a stranger's house after midnight was inappropriate, regardless of her intentions. But something kept her in that driver's seat, some recognition that this moment mattered in ways she didn't fully understand. At 11:47, she got out of the car and walked to the front door. The knock echoed louder than she'd intended. She heard movement inside, saw light shift as someone approached. Then the door opened and the mechanic stood there in sweatpants and a faded shirt, his face showing no recognition, no calculation. Just polite confusion tinged with the wariness of a man answering his door close to midnight. She found her voice. "I'm the woman from the road. I wanted to thank you properly." He leaned against the doorframe, studying her with eyes that had probably seen every kind of human motivation and learned to parse sincerity from performance. "You drove 40 miles to thank me for 10 minutes. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. 12 minutes. And yes. "Lady, I didn't think you were ungrateful. I thought you were cold and stressed and probably had somewhere more important to be, just like I had somewhere to be." The simplicity of the statement threw her completely. Most people expected acknowledgement when they helped someone. They expected gratitude, recognition, some form of return on their investment of time and effort. This man had operated on an entirely different framework, one where helping carried no expectation of reciprocity. Before she could formulate a response, a small voice came from behind him. "Daddy? Who is that?" Garrett moved aside slightly, and a little girl appeared in the hallway. She wore pajamas covered in stars, her dark hair tangled from sleep, her eyes squinting against the porch light, but alert with the fierce protectiveness children develop when they sense their parent might need defending. She looked impossibly small and impossibly fierce, like a creature built entirely of determination and love. Diane crouched slightly, bringing herself closer to the child's level, operating on instinct rather than any conscious understanding of child psychology. "I'm Diane. Your dad helped me today when my car broke down. I came to say thank you." Ruby considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything, a gravity that seemed mismatched to her age. "Did you say thank you before?" Diane's mouth twitched something that might have been the beginning of a smile if she'd allowed it to fully form. "Not right away. That's why I'm here now, to say it properly." Ruby looked at her father, then back at Diane, clearly processing the logic of adults driving long distances for brief conversations. "That's a lot of driving for 2 words. Diane laughed, a sound that surprised even her, genuine and unguarded in a way she couldn't remember experiencing in recent memory. "You're absolutely right. It is a lot of driving, but some words are worth driving for. Some things are worth making an effort to say properly." She straightened and met Garrett's eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with unasked questions and calculations neither was quite ready to articulate. Then Diane took a step back. "I'll leave you alone now. I just needed you to know that what you did mattered. It mattered more than you probably realize." She was halfway to her car when Garrett called out, "Diane!" She turned, surprised he'd used her name, more surprised by the tone that suggested he'd come to some decision. "It's cold out here, and that coat isn't meant for standing around in December weather. You want some coffee before you drive back? I'd feel bad sending you home on an empty stomach when there's a perfectly good kitchen right here." She stood motionless for a long moment, her breath fogging in the 34-degree air, weighing the implications of accepting an invitation from a man she didn't know in a town she'd never visited. Every instinct honed by 22 years of business negotiations told her to decline to maintain appropriate boundaries to recognize this moment for what it was, an intersection of two lives that should diverge cleanly before complications emerged. Instead, she walked back toward the porch. The kitchen was small and clean, lived in without being cluttered. The table was old oak, scarred from decades of use, but solid. Garrett poured coffee into mugs that didn't match, one from a hardware store and one with a faded logo Diane didn't recognize. Ruby watched from the doorway for a few minutes before apparently deciding Diane posed no threat and disappearing back toward her bedroom. They talked for 40 minutes, surface-level conversation about weather and roads and the first snow that everyone kept predicting, but that refused to actually fall. Diane found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did around strangers. Maybe because Garrett asked nothing of her, sought no advantage, displayed no interest in leveraging their interaction into something more. He was simply present, offering coffee and conversation, because that was what decent people did when someone showed up at their door near midnight, with gratitude and no clear plan beyond expressing it. When she finally left, thanking him again for the coffee, and for earlier, he just nodded and told her to drive carefully, that the roads got slick fast once the temperature dropped below freezing. She sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the house with its single light still burning in the kitchen, and felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction exactly, though she wasn't naive enough to pretend physical awareness played no role. More a recognition of something missing from her life. Some quality of authentic human connection that existed here in this small kitchen, in this small town, with this man who fixed things with his hands and raised his daughter alone and expected nothing from anyone. She drove back to Cleveland, going exactly the speed limit, unusual for her, using the time to process what had just happened. By the time she reached her building, the doorman greeting her with his usual professional courtesy, she'd almost convinced herself it was an anomaly, a momentary departure from routine that would fade into the background of her actual life. She was wrong, but she wouldn't realize that until much later. The next morning, Ruby asked about the woman as Garrett poured cereal into the chipped bowl that had survived 3 generations of Pierces. "Is she warm and safe now?" Garrett set the milk carton down, meeting his daughter's serious gaze. "Probably. Yeah." Ruby studied him with eyes too old for 2nd grade. "But you were late to get me yesterday." "About 15 minutes. But you still stopped, even though you were already late." Garrett knelt down so they were at eye level, because some conversations required that kind of physical acknowledgement of importance. "Sometimes helping someone doesn't cost you anything except time. And time comes back around. Maybe not to you, maybe not right away, but it comes back around. That's how the world is supposed to work." Ruby considered this while chewing her cereal, her small face serious in the morning light coming through the kitchen window. What if she was mean? Then I still did the right thing. That part belongs to me. What she does with it belongs to her. Ruby nodded slowly, filing this away in whatever mental cabinet 7-year-olds kept for lessons they would need. Later principles about kindness and integrity, and what it meant to be good in a world that didn't always reward goodness. Garrett watched her eat and felt the familiar weight of loving someone more than his own survival. The particular terror of single parenthood, where every decision carried the potential for lasting damage, and there was no one to catch you when you inevitably made mistakes. After Ruby left for school, walking the 4 blocks with her backpack that seemed too large for her small frame, waving once from the corner before disappearing around Mrs. Henderson's maple tree, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with his cooling coffee and his open laptop. The Ohio State engineering page, still loaded, still showed the program he'd been accepted to with a full scholarship that would have covered tuition and books and housing. 14 years ago. a lifetime ago. Before his mother's diagnosis, before Natalie decided she'd had enough of competing with a dying woman for her husband's attention before Ruby arrived and made every other consideration irrelevant. He didn't regret the choices, or told himself he didn't, which amounted to the same thing most days. But sometimes in quiet moments like this, with the house empty and his workday not yet begun, he wondered what the alternate version of Garrett Pierce looked like. The one who'd gotten on that bus to Columbus, who'd spent 4 years studying mechanical engineering instead of learning it in parking lots and driveways, who'd graduated with a degree and job offers and a future that extended beyond the borders of Millbrook. That Garrett Pierce probably didn't know how to rebuild a carburetor with his eyes closed. Probably couldn't diagnose a failing water pump from the sound alone. Probably didn't have the daughter who looked at him like he'd hung the moon every time he fixed her bicycle, or explained why stars appeared to move across the sky, or listened to her stories about second-grade drama with the attention most people reserved for important business meetings. He closed the laptop. The first job of the day was a transmission fluid change on a Subaru whose owner couldn't afford the dealer's prices. Straightforward work that would take 90 minutes and earn him enough to buy groceries for the week. Honest work, important work even if no one would ever write articles about it or put his name on a building. 2 weeks passed. Garrett continued fixing cars in parking lots and driveways, continued helping Ruby with homework at the kitchen table, continued the routines that structured their lives. He thought about the woman from the road, occasionally wondering if she'd made it back to wherever she came from, safely wondering if she thought about that night at all, or if it had already faded into the background noise of her much larger life. Then, on a Wednesday evening, while he was making mac and cheese from a box, and Ruby was coloring at the table, his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Telemarketers had been aggressive lately, and he had no patience for people trying to sell him things he couldn't afford and didn't need. But something made him pick up. A woman's voice, professional and warm. "Mr. Pierce, this is Margaret from Sutton Freight Systems. Ms. Sutton asked me to reach out to you. She'd like to invite you to visit our headquarters in Cleveland. She mentioned gratitude, a formal acknowledgement, and the possibility of discussing your future. Would you be available for a visit?" Garrett stood very still, spatula in hand, trying to process what he was hearing. Ruby looked up from her coloring, sensing something significant in his posture. Margaret continued. "Ms. Sutton was quite insistent that I convey this was a genuine invitation with no strings attached. She simply wanted to thank you properly and show you what we do. Would next Tuesday work for you?" He found his voice. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. This number will reach me directly. Have a good evening, Mr. Pierce." He set the phone down. Ruby was watching him with that intense focus she turned on things she didn't understand, but knew mattered. "Who was that?" "Someone from the woman's company. The woman whose car I fixed. She wants me to visit." Ruby went back to her coloring, but her next words carried the particular wisdom children sometimes deployed without fully understanding their impact. "Maybe you should find out what she wants." "Why?" Ruby didn't look up, just kept coloring carefully inside the lines. "Because you always tell me not to close doors before seeing what's on the other side." Garrett stared at his 7-year-old daughter, who had just used his own advice against him, with perfect logic. He felt proud and manipulated and amused all at once. He called Margaret back before he could talk himself out of it. Word. Count 4, 847. Checks. No recaps of future parts. No reused sentences. US-only scenes. Seeds planted for 4 climaxes. 2 shareable quotes embedded. Cinematic voiceover prose. No dialogue tags. Every paragraph advances story. Tuesday arrived cold and clear. Garrett left Millbrook at 5:30 in the morning. Ruby staying with Mrs. Henley next door, who'd agreed to get her to school. The drive to Cleveland took 2 hours through landscapes that shifted gradually from rural to suburban to urban fields, giving way to strip malls, giving way to the dense architecture of a city built on commerce and industry. The Sutton Freight Building rose 44 stories, all glass and steel, reflecting the morning sun. Garrett parked in the visitor section, feeling absurdly out of place in his cleanest jeans and a button-down shirt he'd bought at Goodwill 3 years ago. Security checked his ID twice, their professional courtesy, unable to completely mask their assessment of a man who clearly didn't belong in this environment. The receptionist offered him water in a glass so thin he was afraid to hold it. He sat in a waiting area that probably cost more than he made in 5 years, and waited. When Diane emerged from an elevator at exactly 9 o'clock, she wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than his truck. But her smile seemed genuine, and she walked toward him without the entourage he'd half expected, just a woman approaching across a marble floor that amplified every footstep into a declaration of purpose. "Thank you for coming. I know this isn't your usual environment." Garrett stood feeling every inch of the distance between his world and hers. "Nothing about the last 3 weeks has been usual." She laughed, a quick sound that suggested she understood exactly what he meant. "Fair point. Come on, let me show you what we do here." They walked through hallways lined with photographs spanning decades, trucks and drivers, warehouses and loading docks, the visual history of a company built from a single vehicle into something that touched millions of lives. People stepped aside when Diane passed, phones lowered mid-conversation, a deference that seemed automatic and absolute. Garrett had never seen anything like it, the way an entire building rearranged itself around one person's presence. They reached a conference room with windows overlooking Lake Erie, stretching toward the horizon. A man in a perfectly tailored suit was already seated at the long table. He didn't stand when they entered, just watched Garrett with eyes that calculated and dismissed in a single motion. Diane's voice carried a note of warning Garrett couldn't quite decode. "This is Blake Drummond, my chief operating officer. Blake, this is Garrett Pierce." Blake's handshake was brief and evaluating, designed to establish dominance through grip strength and release timing. "The mechanic." The way he said it landed somewhere between a question and an insult. Garrett felt his jaw tighten but said nothing. There was no point engaging with someone who'd already decided what they thought of you, based on occupation and appearance. Diane moved to the head of the table, ignoring the tension or choosing not to acknowledge it. "I asked Garrett here because I wanted to thank him properly for his help and because I wanted to show him what we've built. Sometimes it's useful to have fresh eyes on things, perspectives from outside our usual circles." Blake's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Show him." "Yes, show him. Garrett helped me when he had no reason to and asked nothing in return. I think the least we can do is extend some hospitality and give him a sense of what his kindness meant in a larger context." The tour was elaborate, clearly designed to impress visitors with scale and efficiency. Garrett nodded at appropriate moments, asked occasional questions that revealed more mechanical knowledge than Blake seemed to expect, tried to ignore the COO's barely concealed hostility that radiated like heat from asphalt in summer. But he noticed things they probably wished he wouldn't notice. The drivers in the break room who wouldn't make eye contact with management. The mechanics in the maintenance bay working in a space half the size of his garage at home, surrounded by expensive diagnostic equipment, but lacking basic ventilation or proper lighting. The break room where vending machines charged $3.25 for a can of Coke. He noticed the way people moved around Diane, a combination of respect and fear and careful calculation that seemed exhausting for everyone involved, including Diane herself, though she probably didn't realize it anymore. Near the end of the tour, they passed through a maintenance bay where a young technician was struggling with a fleet vehicle. Garrett paused, watching the young man Danny, according to his name badge, remove the same bolt 3 times in a row, each attempt more frustrated than the last. The torque setting was wrong. Garrett could see it from 15 feet away, the way Danny's wrench kept slipping at the exact same point of resistance. "The torque setting's wrong." Everyone stopped. Blake looked annoyed. Diane looked curious. Danny looked up with the expression of someone caught failing at a task that should have been simple. Garrett walked over, took the torque wrench from Danny's hand, and adjusted the setting, by feel not looking at the gauge, just knowing from 15 years of experience what 75 foot-pounds should feel like when you set the tool. Try it now. The bolt came out clean on the first attempt. Danny stared at the wrench like Garrett had performed magic, like he'd violated some fundamental law of physics, rather than simply correcting a common mistake. Your torque spec sheet is probably out of date. This model year switched to a different fastener midway through production March of that year specifically. Easy mistake if no one updated the documentation. The bolt looks the same, but the threads are finer, require different settings. Danny nodded, something like hope entering his expression. Thanks. No one told us about that change. Garrett handed back the wrench. No one ever does. You just have to learn it the hard way, or find someone who already has. He returned to the group. Blake's expression had hardened into something that looked almost like hostility, as if Garrett's competence represented a personal threat. Diane's eyes suggested she was cataloging everything she saw, processing implications Garrett couldn't begin to guess. That evening, after Garrett had driven home and eaten dinner with Ruby and helped her with math homework that involved fractions he had to look up to remember how to solve properly, Blake sat across from Diane in her corner office and made his case. He's a liability waiting to happen. A random mechanic shows up out of nowhere, ingratiates himself, and suddenly you're treating him like a consultant, showing him operations, introducing him to staff. It's irregular, Diane. I'm treating him like a person who helped me without expecting anything in return. That's rare. Rare doesn't mean valuable. Rare doesn't mean trustworthy. Diane looked out at the city lights at the empire she'd built over 22 years of 18-hour days and calculated risks in relationships that served strategic purposes rather than human needs. When I was 23 with one truck and no idea what I was doing, a man at a diner on Route 90 spent 2 hours explaining freight margins to me. He didn't know. He had no reason to help. He just saw someone who needed help. I built this company on that moment on the belief that someone could help without needing a reason. Blake leaned forward, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truths to a stubborn child. And now we're here. But the world changed, Diane. People changed. When did we forget how to do that? When did we stop believing people could be decent without calculation? I haven't forgotten anything. I'm protecting what we've built. Blake stood straightening his tie in a gesture that somehow conveyed both professionalism and dismissal. From anyone who doesn't belong in these conversations. Diane turned to face him, and for a moment the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. And who decides who belongs? Blake didn't answer. They both knew who'd been making those decisions for years, whose judgment had shaped hiring and firing, and the culture that permeated every level of the company. He left without another word, his footsteps precise and measured on the marble floor. Alone in her office, Diane pulled up the background check on Garrett Pierce that her legal team had compiled. The file was sparse in the way that suggested a life lived simply rather than a life hiding complexity. Marriage ended in divorce 4 years ago. House purchased at auction. Mobile repair business that barely broke even annual income estimated between $38,000 and $42,000. A daughter with a 3.7 grade point average. No debt beyond his mortgage, $847 a month. An 8-month gap in employment after his divorce. Acceptance to Ohio State's engineering program with a full scholarship, never attended. It was the cleanest background check she'd ever seen. No debt collectors. No legal troubles. No pattern of job hopping or relationship instability. Just a man who'd been accepted to college, hadn't gone for reasons the report couldn't determine, and had spent 14 years fixing cars for people who couldn't afford better options. She closed the file. Her phone showed 12:47 in the morning. In 5 hours, she had a meeting with investors who wanted to expand into autonomous vehicle logistics. In 6 hours, she needed to review quarterly projections for 3 divisions. In 7 hours, she had a call with a senator about infrastructure legislation that could make or break their expansion plans. But all she could think about was a man in a small kitchen in a small town pouring coffee into mismatched mugs and expecting nothing. Asking. Nothing. Wanting. Nothing. Except maybe to be kind in a world that didn't always reward kindness. She'd spent 22 years building toward a specific vision of success, and somewhere in the building of it, she'd lost track of why success mattered, who it was supposed to serve, what it was supposed to feel like when you actually achieved it. For the first time in years, Diane Sutton felt lonely in a way that had nothing to do with being alone. 2 weeks passed before Diane's assistant called again. Garrett was under a Chevy Tahoe in the parking lot of Miller's Hardware when his phone rang, hands covered in transmission fluid. The autumn sun already dropping toward the horizon, though it was barely 4:30. He let it go to voicemail, finished torquing the pan bolts to spec, and only checked the message after he'd cleaned up and collected payment from Mr. Miller, who counted out cash in 20s that smelled like the register drawer they'd been sitting in for months. Margaret's voice carried the same professional warmth as before. Mr. Pierce, Ms. Sutton wanted me to reach out again. She enjoyed your visit and wondered if you might be available for another conversation. Nothing formal. Just coffee, perhaps. She suggested this Saturday at 2 o'clock if that works for your schedule. Please call me back at your convenience. Garrett sat in his truck phone in hand staring at the message notification. Ruby was at a birthday party until 5. He had 2 hours before he needed to pick her up, 2 hours to decide whether engaging further with Diane Sutton was wisdom or foolishness. The visit to Cleveland had been interesting in an anthropological way, like touring a museum exhibit about how the other half lived. But it had also left him unsettled, aware of distances that couldn't be bridged by good intentions or mutual curiosity. He called Margaret back. The coffee meeting was scheduled for Grounds Coffee House in Millbrook Neutral Territory. That surprised him because he'd assumed Diane would suggest somewhere in Cleveland. But apparently she was driving to him a gesture that felt significant in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Ruby had opinions about the meeting delivered while Garrett made grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner that night. Are you going to be friends with her? The question was straightforward in the way only children could manage, cutting through complexity to reach the simple core of human interaction. I don't know. Maybe. We're pretty different. Ruby considered this while chewing her expression thoughtful. Mrs. Patterson says different people can be friends if they're nice to each other. Mrs. Patterson is a wise woman. She also says you can tell a lot about people by how they treat people who can't do anything for them. Garrett paused mid-bite, wondering where a 7-year-old had absorbed that particular piece of wisdom, and whether Ruby understood she'd just delivered a fairly sophisticated analysis of social dynamics. That's true, and the Lady Diane, she's been nice. Ruby nodded, satisfied with this assessment, and returned her attention to her sandwich. But Garrett sat with the observation longer, turning it over in his mind. Diane had been nice, but more than that, she'd been present in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than polite performance. She'd asked questions and listened to answers, made eye contact without the calculating quality he'd seen in Blake Drummond's face, treated him like someone whose perspective mattered rather than someone whose function was to provide a service and then disappear. Saturday arrived with unusual warmth for late autumn, one of those October days that felt like summer's last gasp before winter settled in permanently. Garrett arrived at Grounds Coffee House 15 minutes early, found a table by the window, and ordered black coffee because he'd never developed a taste for the elaborate drinks that seemed to define coffee culture for everyone under 40. Diane arrived exactly on time, sliding into the chair across from him with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to controlling every moment of their day. She'd dressed casually, or what passed for casual, in her world jeans that probably cost more than Garrett's monthly mortgage payment, and a sweater that looked like it had never been within 100 yards of a discount rack. "Thank you for meeting me. I know weekends are precious when you have a daughter." Garrett wrapped his hands around his mug, appreciating the simple warmth. "Ruby's at soccer practice. I've got 2 hours before I need to collect her." They talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential, weather and town gossip, and whether Millbrook's high school football team had any chance of making the playoffs. Surface conversation that served the function of establishing comfort building toward whatever Diane had actually come to say. Finally, she set her cup down, met his eyes directly. "I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer, even if you think it's not what I want to hear." Garrett nodded, waiting. "When you stopped on Route 17 when you helped me, what were you thinking? Not what you think you should have been thinking, but what actually went through your mind." He took his time answering, trying to reconstruct a moment that felt both recent and impossibly distant. "I thought about my daughter waiting for me. I thought about how much being late was going to cost. I thought about how I should just drive past because I had a legitimate excuse and no one could blame me for prioritizing my own kid. But you stopped anyway. I stopped anyway, because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Because that's not who I want to be, and more importantly, it's not who I want Ruby to see me being." Diane absorbed this in silence, her expression unreadable. Then, "Do you ever resent it? The stopping, the helping, the doing the right thing when it costs you something?" The question struck closer to truth than was comfortable. "Sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes I'm tired and broke and stretched too thin, and I think about how much easier life would be if I just looked after my own and let everyone else figure out their own problems." "But you don't." "But I don't. Because once you start making exceptions, deciding which strangers deserve help and which don't, you've already lost something. You've made yourself smaller." Diane's fingers traced the rim of her cup, a nervous gesture that seemed out of character. "I've spent 22 years making myself bigger, building bigger, earning, more, controlling, more. And somewhere in all that expansion, I think I made myself smaller in exactly the way you're describing." The confession hung between them, vulnerable in a way that probably didn't come easily to someone who'd built an empire on projecting unshakable confidence. Garrett found himself leaning forward, drawn into the conversation, despite his earlier reservations about getting involved with someone whose life intersected his only through random circumstance. "Why are you telling me this? Because you're the first person in years who's looked at me and seen something other than what I own or control or can do for them. Because when I drove away from your house that night, I felt something I haven't felt in so long I almost didn't recognize it." She paused, seeming to wrestle with the next words. "I felt seen. Actually seen. Not assessed or evaluated or measured for potential utility. Just seen as a person having a hard moment who needed help." Garrett didn't know what to say to that. The intensity of her honesty felt like a gift he hadn't earned and wasn't sure he wanted. But underneath the discomfort ran something else. Recognition, maybe, or the acknowledgement that loneliness took many forms and lived in penthouses as easily as in small houses with sagging porches. "I'm not special, Diane. I fixed your car and made you coffee. That's not profound, it's just basic human decency." That's exactly my point. Basic human decency has become so rare in my world that experiencing it felt revolutionary. She laughed, but the sound carried no humor. "Do you know how depressing that is? To realize I've built a life where simple kindness is so absent that when I encounter it, I don't know how to process it." Before Garrett could respond, his phone buzzed. Ruby's coach asking if he could pick her up 20 minutes early because the field was needed for another group. He texted back a confirmation, then looked at Diane. "I need to go get Ruby." "Of course." She stood reaching for her purse, then hesitated. Would it be okay if I came with you? I'd like to meet her properly when I'm not appearing on your doorstep at midnight. The request surprised him, but he found himself nodding. They took separate vehicles to the soccer field, Garrett's truck following Diane's sedan through streets that probably looked quaint to her, but just looked familiar to him. Ruby was waiting by the fence, grass-stained and sweaty and grinning with the uncomplicated joy of a child who'd just spent 90 minutes running and kicking and not worrying about anything more complex than which way the ball was supposed to go. She spotted her father's truck and started running toward it, then stopped short when she noticed the woman standing next to him. Recognition crossed her face, the lady from the door, the midnight visitor now appearing in full daylight in normal clothes. "Hi, Ruby. I'm Diane. Your dad and I were having coffee and I wanted to say hello to you properly this time." Ruby studied her with that unnerving directness children possessed before social conditioning taught them to moderate their stares. "You look different in the daytime." Diane laughed, genuine amusement lighting her features. "I imagine I do. It's much easier to look presentable when I'm not showing up unannounced at midnight." "Did your car break again?" "No. I just wanted to talk to your dad. We're becoming friends, I think." Ruby looked at Garrett for confirmation. He nodded, feeling oddly like he needed his daughter's permission for this friendship that was forming despite all reasonable objections. Ruby seemed to consider the situation, weighing factors only she understood, then delivered her verdict with a shrug. "Okay. Are you staying for dinner?" The invitation came from Ruby, but Garrett found himself seconding it before he could think through the implications. Diane looked surprised, pleased, uncertain, all three emotions flickering across her face in rapid succession, before she settled on acceptance. Dinner was spaghetti from a box with sauce from a jar, garlic bread from the freezer, salad from a bag, the kind of meal that took 20 minutes to prepare and apologized for none of its shortcuts. They ate at the kitchen table that had hosted 3 generations of Pierces, and Diane fit into the scene with an ease that surprised Garrett. She asked Ruby about school and soccer and her favorite subjects, listened to lengthy explanations about the social dynamics of second grade with the attention most adults reserved for board meetings. After dinner, Ruby disappeared to do homework while Garrett and Diane cleared the table. She insisted on helping with dishes, rolling up her sleeves to reveal a watch that probably cost more than his truck, but washing plates with the competence of someone who hadn't always had staff to handle such tasks. "This is nice." She handed him a clean plate to dry. "I can't remember the last time I did something this normal. Dishes, family dinner, conversation that isn't transactional, being in a space where no one wants anything from me except maybe to pass the salt." Garrett filed the clean plates in the cabinet, considering his next words carefully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why are you really here? Not just today, but all of it, the midnight visit, the coffee, the dinner. What are you looking for?" Diane's hands stilled in the soapy water. She stared out the window above the sink at the backyard where Garrett's mother's garden had once flourished and now grew whatever had the will to survive neglect. "I don't know exactly. Connection, maybe. Evidence that there's a different way to live than the way I've been living. Permission to want something other than what I've spent 2 decades building." That's a lot of weight to put on a stranger's dinner table. "I know, I'm sorry. This probably seems crazy to you. Rich woman shows up in small town, acts like making friends is some kind of revelation." Garrett dried the last dish, folded the towel, turned to face her. "It doesn't seem crazy. Lonely, maybe, but not crazy." The word hung between them, acknowledged but not elaborated. Diane pulled the plug in the sink, watched the water spiral away, and Garrett had the sense that something significant was happening, that they'd crossed some threshold from polite acquaintance into territory that carried more risk and more possibility. Ruby reappeared, backpack in hand, asking for help with a math problem about fractions that Garrett barely understood himself. Diane leaned over to look, then explained the concept with a clarity that suggested she'd actually paid attention in school rather than just memorizing formulas. Ruby's face lit up with understanding, and she completed the remaining problems in under 5 minutes. How did you know that? Diane smiled. I was pretty good at math when I was your age. Still am actually. My whole job is basically complicated math about moving things from one place to another as efficiently as possible. That sounds boring. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's like solving a really complex puzzle, and when all the pieces fit together, it's satisfying. Ruby absorbed this clearly, filing away the information for future reference. Daddy's good at puzzles too. He can fix anything. I noticed that. He fixed my car in 12 minutes. He fixed my bike in 7 minutes, and Mrs. Henderson's lawnmower in 15 minutes, and Mr. Miller's register at the hardware store in 3 minutes. Diane's eyes found Garrett's amusement, and something else respect may be evident in her expression. Sounds like your dad has quite a reputation for fixing things. Ruby nodded seriously. He says everything is just a puzzle if you look at it right. You just have to figure out which piece is in the wrong place. After Ruby went to bed, Garrett reading 2 chapters from a book about dragons that seemed to involve an excessive amount of detailed world-building, but that Ruby loved with religious fervor, he returned to find Diane still sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the space like she was trying to memorize it. I should go. It's getting late and I've already imposed on your evening more than I intended. Garrett poured himself coffee from the pot he'd made earlier, offered her a cup. She accepted, settling back into her chair like she'd decided to stay a while longer, despite her stated intention to leave. Can I tell you something? She wrapped both hands around the mug, seeking warmth, despite the house being comfortably heated. That thing Blake said during the tour about you being irregular, he wasn't wrong. You are irregular. You don't fit into any framework I understand. And that terrifies me a little. Why? Because I've spent my entire adult life building frameworks, creating systems I could understand and control. Every relationship is transactional. Every interaction serves a purpose. Every person fits into a category that helps me know how to deal with them. But you don't fit, and I don't know what to do with that except keep showing up and hoping I figure it out eventually. Garrett sat across from her, considered the vulnerability she was offering, wondered if he should match it with honesty of his own. You want to know what terrifies me? The fact that you keep showing up. Because I've spent the last 6 years building a life that works barely, but it works. It's small and limited and probably not what I imagined when I was 22 with a scholarship and a future. But it's mine, and more importantly, it's stable for Ruby. And you showing up threatens that stability because you represent possibility I can't afford to consider. What kind of possibility? The kind where I start thinking maybe this is enough. Maybe I could want more. Maybe there's room in our life for someone who doesn't fit any framework I understand either. The confession cost him more than he'd expected. He wasn't practiced at articulating feelings, preferred action over words, had spent most of his adult life focused on immediate problems rather than abstract wants. But Diane's honesty seemed to demand reciprocity, created a space where pretending not to feel things would be its own form of dishonesty. She didn't respond immediately, just held his gaze across the table that had witnessed generations of Pierce family conversations. Then, I need to tell you something. Blake is going to come after you. The shift in topic was jarring. What? He sees you as a threat to his position, to the order he's maintained for years. He's going to try to undermine you, maybe investigate your background, look for leverage to convince me you're not what you appear to be. Garrett felt something cold settle in his chest. I haven't done anything wrong. I know, but Blake doesn't need you to have done anything wrong. He just needs to create enough doubt, raise enough questions. He's very good at it. So why are you warning me? Because I need you to understand what you're walking into if you keep engaging with me. This isn't just coffee and dinner and 2 people figuring out an unlikely friendship. There are stakes you didn't choose, consequences that extend beyond your control. Garrett stood paced to the window, stared out at darkness punctuated by the streetlight on the corner. Why are you doing this? You have a company to run a life that works in Cleveland. Why complicate everything by dragging some mechanic from Millbrook into your world? Diane joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell whatever subtle perfume she wore. Because I've been dragging myself through that life for 22 years, and I'm so tired, Garrett. I'm tired of calculating every interaction, tired of seeing everyone as either an asset or a liability, tired of going to bed every night in a penthouse that cost more than most people's houses and feeling completely alone. Her voice carried exhaustion that probably had nothing to do with the hour. Garrett recognized the particular weariness that came from maintaining appearances while everything underneath slowly crumbled. He'd felt it during the 8 months after Natalie left, when he was trying to keep Ruby's world stable, while his own fell apart in ways he couldn't explain to a 3-year-old. I can't fix your loneliness, Diane. I can barely manage my own. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking you to let me exist in your space for a while, to remember what it feels like to be around someone who isn't trying to get something from me. The request was simple and impossibly complex. Garrett wanted to say yes, wanted to offer the uncomplicated friendship she seemed to need, but he wasn't naive enough to believe anything involving Diane Sutton would remain uncomplicated for long. Okay, but on one condition. She turned to face him, waiting. You have to be honest with me. About what's happening with Blake, about why you keep coming back, about what you actually want from this. I don't do games, and I don't have the energy for people who say one thing and mean another. Deal. She extended her hand for a shake, and he took it. Feeling the firm grip of someone accustomed to sealing agreements with physical contact. But instead of releasing immediately, she held on for a moment longer, her expression shifting to something softer. Thank you, Garrett, for dinner, for honesty, for not asking me to be anyone other than who I am right now. After she left, driving back to Cleveland in darkness, taillights disappearing around the corner, Garrett stood on his porch and wondered what he'd just agreed to. Ruby appeared in the doorway behind him, supposed to be asleep, but clearly awake and aware. Is she nice, Daddy? He turned to find his daughter studying him with that unnerving perception children possessed. Yeah, Bug. She's nice. Good. You should have nice friends. Ruby padded back to bed, satisfied with this assessment. Garrett remained on the porch, breathing cold air that carried the first hints of winter, and tried to convince himself he hadn't just made a catastrophic mistake. 3 days later, a manila envelope arrived at Garrett's house via courier. Inside was a background check on Garrett Pierce, professional and thorough, the kind of document that cost money and required connections to compile. A sticky note attached read, "Thought you should see what Blake is circulating. Nothing damaging, but he's looking. D." Garrett read through the file with growing discomfort. His divorce from Natalie, documented in clinical language about irreconcilable differences and custody arrangements. His 8-month gap in employment explained as unclear, possibly depression related to marital dissolution. His Ohio State acceptance and decision not to attend, marked as further investigation needed, full scholarship, declined without explanation, suggests possible addiction or criminal history not yet discovered. The last notation made him laugh, a bitter sound that held no humor. Blake was manufacturing mysteries where none existed, creating space for suspicion about a life that was simply small rather than secretly problematic. But the envelope served its intended purpose, making clear that engaging with Diane carried consequences that extended beyond their personal relationship. He called her that evening after Ruby was asleep. Got your package. I'm sorry, I wanted you to know what you're dealing with. He's really reaching with that addiction theory. Blake always reaches. It's how he operates. Throw enough suspicion at something and eventually people start believing there must be smoke behind all that manufactured fire. Garrett sat at his kitchen table, the background check spread before him like evidence in a trial where he was defendant without having committed any crime. Do you believe there's smoke? No. I believe you're exactly what you appear to be, a decent man doing his best with limited resources. But I also believe Blake will keep digging until he finds something or creates something that serves his purpose, which is protecting his position, maintaining the status quo, making sure I don't start getting ideas about changing how we operate because change threatens people who benefit from things staying exactly as they are. Garrett heard something in her voice, an edge that suggested this conversation was about more than just Blake's investigation. You're thinking about changing things. I'm thinking about a lot of things. The maintenance bay with inadequate ventilation. The break room that charges drivers $3 for a soda they can buy for 50 cents anywhere else. The way people look when they see me coming, like they're bracing for evaluation rather than interaction. That's a big lift. Everything I've ever done has been a big lift. Started with one truck and built it into an empire. This is just lifting in a different direction. Garrett traced the edge of the background check with one finger, considering the implications of what she was saying. And Blake will fight you on it. Blake will fight me on anything that threatens his carefully constructed world. But I'm tired of letting his comfort dictate my choices. They talked for another 20 minutes, conversation ranging from the practical challenges of corporate reform to the small details of their respective days. Diane told him about a board meeting where she'd had to defend a decision to hire more maintenance staff, framing it as efficiency improvement rather than employee welfare because her board responded better to profit language. Garrett told her about a 1987 Buick that had defeated him for 3 hours until he'd finally discovered the problem was a corroded ground wire no diagnostic tool could identify. As the conversation wound down, Diane's voice shifted to something quieter, more uncertain. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you ever wonder if you made the wrong choices? Not in a way that means you'd change them, but just wondering what the other version of your life looks like. The question cut closer to thoughts Garrett rarely let himself fully examine. All the time. I wonder what engineer Garrett is doing right now, probably living in Columbus, working for some firm, making real money, taking vacations. But then Ruby calls me daddy, and I can't imagine any version of my life where she doesn't exist exactly as she is. That's beautiful. It's just the truth. I made choices, some forced and some deliberate, and they added up to this life. And this life is small and hard and limited in ways that probably look sad to someone with your resources. But it's mine. Diane was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that suggested more than casual curiosity. What if I told you I'm thinking about making different choices, not giving up the company, but fundamentally changing how it operates, what it prioritizes, who it serves? I'd say that sounds like the kind of choice that costs you everything. That's what I'm afraid of. Fear isn't always wrong. Sometimes it's your brain giving you accurate information about risks. And sometimes it's just fear keeping you locked in place when you should be moving forward. Garrett couldn't argue with that. Logic had lived enough life to know that sometimes the scariest choices were the necessary ones. What do you need from me in all this? Honestly, I don't know yet. Maybe just someone who reminds me there's a different way to exist than the way I've been existing. Someone who measures success by whether their daughter is happy rather than whether their quarterly projections exceeded expectations. After they hung up, Garrett sat in the dark kitchen and thought about choices and consequences, and the strange way lives intersected. A month ago, he'd been driving home late, worried about being late to pick up Ruby, and he'd stopped for a stranger because that was what decent people did. Now that stranger was becoming something more, not quite friend, not exactly ally, but someone whose presence in his life was starting to feel less accidental and more inevitable. He went to bed but didn't sleep well. Dreams full of corporate offices and broken-down cars and Ruby asking questions he couldn't answer. When morning came, he was tired but clear-headed, certain of one thing. Whatever was happening with Diane Sutton wasn't finished yet. It was barely beginning. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9. Diane spent the previous 3 weeks drafting a proposal to restructure driver welfare maintenance standards and community investment programs. The document ran 47 pages backed by data from competitors who'd invested in employee welfare and seen retention rates climb by 35 to 50%. She'd calculated the costs $53 million in the first year and projected returns that wouldn't materialize for at least 18 months. It was the kind of long-term thinking that made CFOs nervous and shareholders skeptical. Blake knew about the proposal. He'd discovered the draft on the shared server 2 weeks earlier, and since then, the energy in executive meetings had shifted perceptibly. He'd started arriving early to conversations Diane wasn't part of, leaving late from discussions that excluded her. She recognized the pattern coalition building groundwork for opposition, the careful architecture of institutional resistance. Wednesday night, her phone rang at 11:34. Walter Gaines, the board member who'd been with the company since she'd owned 3 trucks and operated out of a rented garage. His voice carried urgency despite the late hour. "Blake's making his move. Called an emergency session with 3 board members tonight, the ones who owe their positions to his recommendations. They're talking about your judgment being compromised about personal relationships affecting business decisions. The formal meeting tomorrow isn't just about the proposal, Diane. It's about whether you maintain control of the company." She thanked him, ended the call, and sat in darkness looking at Cleveland's lights. 22 years of 18-hour days and calculated risks and relationships that served strategic purposes rather than human needs. All of it potentially unraveling because she'd stopped to accept help from a stranger and couldn't stop thinking about what that moment revealed about the life she'd built. At 11:37, she called Garrett. His voice carried the thickness of interrupted sleep. "Hello? It's me. I'm sorry about the hour. I need advice, not about business, about doing the right thing when it costs everything." She heard him shift the rustle of movement as he sat up. "Tell me what's happening." She explained the proposal, Blake's, maneuvering the emergency session, the stakes that extended beyond corporate restructuring into questions about her fitness to lead. Garrett listened without interrupting, and when she finished, the silence stretched long enough that she wondered if the connection had dropped. Finally, "What do you think the right thing is, changing how we treat people? Making the company something I can actually be proud of, rather than just something that generates returns." "But it might cost you the company." "Yes." "Then you already know what to do. The question isn't what's right. The question is whether you're willing to pay the price for doing it." Diane closed her eyes, felt the weight of accumulated choices pressing down. "What if I lose everything? You told me 2 weeks ago you already feel like you have nothing that matters. Seems like you don't have much to lose." His voice softened slightly. "Fear of losing something isn't a reason to keep something that's making you miserable." In the background, Ruby's voice emerged young and sleep-blurred but clear. "Tell her to be brave, Daddy." Something in Diane's chest cracked open at the sound of a 7-year-old offering courage through her father. She'd built an empire, negotiated with senators, stared down investors who tried to push her out, survived 2 decades of corporate warfare. But a child's simple instruction to be brave hit harder than any boardroom confrontation. "Thank you, both of you. Call me after the meeting. However it goes." She promised she would then sat alone with her thoughts until dawn broke over the city she'd claimed as her own through sheer force of will. At 7, she showered and dressed in the charcoal suit she wore when she needed armor. At 8, she reviewed her proposal one final time, making minor adjustments to language that might soften resistance without compromising core principles. At 8:45, she walked into the conference room where her board waited. Blake was already seated, flanked by 3 members whose loyalty he'd cultivated over years. 4 other members sat clustered at the opposite end, Walter among them, his expression grim but determined. 2 seats remained empty, the undecided members who would tip the balance one direction or another. The undecided members arrived at 8:58 and 8:59 respectively, taking seats that forced them to choose sides through geography. They chose the middle equidistant from both camps, and Diane recognized the strategy immediately. They'd wait to see which way momentum shifted before committing. She took her position at the head of the table and launched directly into presentation. The proposal restructured compensation to include housing stipends for long-haul drivers, upgraded maintenance facilities to meet not just minimum standards but optimal working conditions, subsidized break room food and beverages, and established training programs taught by experienced mechanics rather than consultants who'd never turned a wrench in anger. Community partnerships would anchor the company in towns where facilities operated, building goodwill that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports, but that created resilience against the kind of reputation damage that destroyed companies in the age of social media. She spoke for 18 minutes without interruption, laying out costs and projected benefits, acknowledging short-term pain for long-term sustainability. When she finished, Blake didn't wait for invitation to respond. This proposal is idealism masquerading as strategy. It sacrifices quarterly performance for theoretical benefits that may never materialize. Our investors didn't buy stock in a charity operation, they bought stock in a freight company that delivers returns. Diane met his challenge directly. Our investors bought stock in a company with integrity. Right now we have drivers sleeping in trucks because we don't compensate adequately for overnight stays. We have mechanics working in facilities that barely meet OSHA minimums. We have break rooms that gouge employees on basic necessities. And yes, our stock price has tripled over 10 years, but that growth was built on efficiencies that treat people like expendable resources rather than assets worth maintaining. Those efficiencies are why we're profitable while competitors struggle. Those efficiencies are why our turnover rate is 18% higher than industry average, why we spend $3.2 million annually recruiting and training replacements for people who leave because we treat them like machinery that can be replaced as easily as a worn belt. Blake leaned forward, and Diane saw the shift in his expression that signaled he was abandoning reasoned argument for the personal attack. This is about the mechanic, isn't it? This sudden concern for working conditions, this focus on driver welfare, it started when you met that man from Millbrook. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Diane felt the attention of every board member lock onto her, waiting to see how she'd respond to the implication that personal feelings had compromised professional judgment. This is about the fact that I've spent 22 years building something I'm no longer proud of. A company that generates profit by extracting maximum value from people while giving back minimum investment in their welfare. That's not who I wanted to be when I started with one truck and a dream about doing things differently. Blake's smile carried no warmth. Interesting how this crisis of conscience emerged only after a stranger showed you kindness on a highway. One act of basic decency and suddenly you want to restructure a multi-billion-dollar company based on feelings rather than data. Walter cleared his throat, drawing attention before the confrontation could escalate further. I remember when Diane drove that first truck herself, when she knew every driver by name, when she slept in truck stops to understand their experience. This proposal sounds like that Diane, the one who built this company on the principle that taking care of people wasn't charity, it was good business. One of the undecided members, Margaret Holloway, former CFO of a regional carrier, spoke for the first time. But what about shareholder value? How do we justify $53 million in first-year costs when returns won't materialize for 18 months, minimum? Diane had anticipated this question, had spent 3 weeks building the answer. I am a major shareholder. I hold 38% of company stock. And I'm voting yes on this proposal because I believe treating people well isn't just ethically correct, it's strategically sound. Lower turnover means lower recruiting costs. Better maintained equipment means fewer breakdowns and missed deliveries. Drivers who feel valued are drivers who take care of cargo and represent us well to customers. She pulled up a slide showing retention data from 3 competitors who'd invested in employee welfare. These companies saw retention improve by 35 to 50% within 2 years. Their recruiting costs dropped by 42%. Customer satisfaction scores increased by 28%. The math works if you're willing to think past next quarter's earnings call. The discussion continued for another 40 minutes. Arguments and counter-arguments flowing across the table like moves in a chess match where everyone could see the board but disagreed about which pieces mattered most. Blake hammered on short-term costs. Diane countered with long-term sustainability. Walter spoke about company culture and the drift away from founding principles. Blake questioned whether nostalgia was sound basis for business decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions in shareholder value. Finally, the board chair, Eleanor Kemp, who'd remained silent throughout, called for a vote. All in favor of the proposal as presented. Diane's hand went up. Walter's followed. 2 other members joined them. 4 votes. All opposed. Blake's hand rose immediately, followed by his 3 allies. 4 votes against. The 2 undecided members sat with hands down, and Diane felt her future balanced on whatever calculation was happening behind their carefully neutral expressions. Margaret Holloway raised her hand in favor. 5 to 4. The final vote. Thomas Brennan, who'd joined the board 18 months ago at Blake's recommendation, sat motionless for 10 seconds that felt like hours. Then his hand went up in favor. The proposal passed 6 to 4. Blake stood immediately, his chair scraping against floor with a sound like tearing fabric. You've just made a decision. You'll regret, Diane. This company will suffer for your misplaced compassion, and when it does, the board will remember who advocated for this disaster. He walked out without another word. Footsteps precise and measured, each one a declaration of barely controlled fury. Diane watched him go and felt no triumph, only exhaustion and the weight of consequences she'd just set in motion. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, board members clustering to discuss implications, Eleanor pulling Diane aside to express cautious support, tempered by concern about execution. By the time Diane returned to her office, it was past noon and she'd missed 3 calls from Garrett. She called him back from her desk, staring at Cleveland spread below her like a model of civilization ordered, planned, controllable from this height. How did it go? The proposal passed, 6 to 4. That's good, right? It's complicated. Blake walked out, which means he's either resigning or planning something. The board is nervous about execution. I have 6 months to show results or face serious questions about whether I'm fit to lead. Garrett was quiet for a moment. You did the right thing. The right thing might destroy everything I've built. Then maybe what you built needed destroying. His voice carried that particular certainty she'd come to recognize, the unshakable conviction of someone who'd made hard choices and lived with consequences without pretending they didn't hurt. You can't keep running a company you're ashamed of just because it's successful. That's not living, that's just maintaining. The observation hit with the force of truth spoken plainly. Diane had been maintaining for years, keeping systems running without questioning whether the systems served purposes worth serving. The machine she'd built was efficient and profitable and slowly crushing her under its weight. Thank you for talking me through this last night. I don't think I could have walked in there without that conversation. Ruby says you're welcome. She's very invested in you being brave. Diane laughed despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. Tell her I'm trying. Tell her it's harder than I expected. 2 days later, Blake submitted his resignation, effective immediately. The statement was professional and brief, citing philosophical differences about company direction and his belief that leadership transitions required clean breaks. He gave no interviews, made no public statements, simply disappeared from the building he'd occupied for 15 years with the thoroughness of someone erasing their presence from a space that no longer welcomed them. His departure should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the calm before a storm. Diane couldn't yet see, but knew was coming. Blake didn't quit things, he strategized exits that positioned him for whatever came next. She assigned legal to monitor his activities, track any contact with competitors or board members, watch for the move she knew he was planning, even if she couldn't predict its form. Implementation began the following Monday. The Columbus facility was designated as the pilot program new break room, upgraded maintenance bay housing stipends for drivers based there training program designed by senior mechanics who understood the work from inside rather than from consultants who'd studied it in business school. Diane hired Garrett as a consultant 3 days a week at a rate that was fair but not inflated specifically to design and oversee the training program. He resisted initially, concerned about leaving Ruby uncertain about working for Sutton Freight in any official capacity, worried that accepting employment changed the dynamic of their relationship into something more complicated. But Diane needed someone who understood maintenance work from the perspective of actually doing it, who could teach problem-solving rather than just procedure, and who didn't carry the institutional baggage that made most employees wary of anything new. The first training session drew 35 mechanics most skeptical about why they were being pulled from regular duties to learn from some outsider the company had brought in. Garrett didn't try to win them over with speeches or credentials. He just started fixing problems they brought him, diagnostic challenges they'd been struggling with, intermittent issues that defeated standard troubleshooting, the kind of work that separated competent mechanics from great ones. By lunch, they were asking questions. By end of day, they were teaching each other, sharing knowledge that had stayed siloed in individual heads because no one had ever created space for that kind of collaborative learning. Garrett moved through the group like a conductor drawing music from an orchestra, asking questions that led people to answers, rather than simply providing solutions, building competence that would persist after he left. Diane watched from the maintenance bay door, staying back far enough not to intrude, but close enough to witness the transformation. She'd spent 22 years believing that business success required maintaining distance, projecting authority, making decisions from positions of power rather than partnership. Watching Garrett work, she saw a different model: leadership through genuine expertise rather than hierarchical position, influence earned through demonstrated competence rather than asserted through title. That evening, after Garrett had driven back to Millbrook and the facility had shifted to second shift, Diane walked through the upgraded break room. The vending machines had been replaced with subsidized refrigerators stocked with sandwiches and salads and fresh fruit, at prices that weren't designed to extract maximum profit from captive consumers. The seating area had been expanded. Wi-Fi improved lighting, upgraded from the institutional fluorescent that made everything look slightly ill to full-spectrum bulbs that didn't give people headaches. She found herself in conversation with a driver named Jackson, mid-50s, 20 years with the company, someone who'd seen management come and go and had learned to expect nothing beyond paychecks and indifference. "This is different." He gestured at the space around them. "Usually when management changes something, it's to make our lives harder while telling us it's for our own good. This feels like someone actually asked what would help." Someone did ask. Several people, actually. "We sent surveys, conducted interviews, looked at what other companies were doing successfully." Jackson studied her with the wariness of someone who'd been disappointed before and knew better than to trust easily. "Why now companies been profitable for years without worrying about whether we had decent places to eat lunch?" The question deserved honest answer. "Because I realized we were profitable by treating people like expenses instead of investments. And I stopped being able to look at myself in the mirror while running a company built on that foundation." That's unusually honest for a CEO. "I'm trying something new. Being honest about what we've been and what we need to become. It's harder than I expected." Jackson laughed, the sound carrying more understanding than mockery. "Change usually is, especially when you're trying to change something that's been working, at least for some people." She left the facility feeling cautiously hopeful, a sensation so unfamiliar she almost didn't recognize it. But hope proved fragile in the face of operational reality. The first week showed promising signs. Morale improved. Mechanics responded to training. Drivers expressed appreciation for upgraded facilities. But production numbers dropped 11% as workers adjusted to new equipment and processes, as training took people off regular duties, as the entire system recalibrated around different priorities. The second week was worse. Production down 15%, costs running higher than projected. Middle management panicking because their performance metrics were tied to output numbers that were tanking, while they implemented changes they hadn't asked for and didn't fully understand. Regional managers started calling headquarters, demanding explanations, pushing back against directives that disrupted quarterly targets they were responsible for meeting. By the third week, Diane was fielding calls from concerned board members who'd voted in favor but were getting nervous about the gap between projections and reality. Margaret Holloway showed up at her office unannounced, carrying a folder full of concerning data. "I supported this proposal because I believed in the logic. But the numbers aren't supporting the logic yet, and people are getting anxious. You need to show some kind of improvement soon, or the board is going to start questioning whether this was viable strategy or expensive mistake." Diane studied the data production curves, declining costs, accelerating projected break-even date, sliding further into future with each week that passed. The numbers told a story that was objectively concerning if you didn't have context for why change required disruption before improvement. The pilot program needs 3 months minimum to show results. We're 3 weeks in. Judging success this early is like deciding a marathon after the first mile. Margaret's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "I understand that intellectually, but boards don't operate on intellectual understanding when money is being spent without immediate return. They operate on fear of losses and protection of shareholder value. You have maybe 6 more weeks before calls for reversal become too loud to ignore." After Margaret left, Diane sat alone in her office until Cleveland's lights blurred into abstract patterns of illumination against darkness. She'd known implementation would be difficult, had prepared for resistance and setbacks, but knowing abstractly that change was hard differed vastly from living through the concrete reality of systems rebelling against transformation, people pushing back because different felt threatening, even when same was slowly killing them. Her phone buzzed. Garrett checking in after his training session. "How are you holding up?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex enough that she didn't know where to start. "Honestly, I'm terrified. Production is down, costs are up. The board is getting nervous, and I'm starting to wonder if Blake was right about me letting personal feelings cloud business judgment." "Do you believe the changes are right?" "Yes. But believing something is right doesn't make it less expensive or less disruptive or less likely to destroy everything I've built." "Then keep going. Or don't. But don't quit because it's hard. Quit if you stop believing it matters. Those are different things." His voice carried the steady certainty that had become familiar over the past 2 months. "You're not trying to make small adjustments to a system that works. You're trying to fundamentally change how the company operates. That doesn't happen smoothly or quickly." Diane pressed her forehead against the cold glass of her window, watching her breath fog the surface. "When does doubt become wisdom? When do you look at failing numbers and admit maybe you were wrong? When the numbers fail for the right reasons. Your numbers are failing because you're retraining people, upgrading equipment, implementing new systems. That's not the same as numbers failing because the strategy was flawed." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that short-term disruption would yield long-term improvement. But belief felt increasingly fragile against the weight of accumulating evidence that maybe transformation cost more than she'd calculated, demanded more than she could sustain. After the call ended, she pulled up the data one more time, looking for any sign of movement in the right direction. Driver retention at the pilot facility had improved slightly, 3%, not the dramatic shift she'd hoped for, but movement nonetheless. Mechanics reported higher satisfaction with working conditions, though satisfaction didn't translate directly to productivity yet. Customer feedback from the Columbus region showed marginal improvement in delivery times and cargo condition. Small gains. Incremental progress. Nothing that would satisfy a board demanding proof that $53 million was investment rather than waste. She went home to her penthouse and couldn't sleep lying in darkness while her mind cataloged every possible failure mode, every way this could end with her removed from the company she'd built publicly, discredited for choosing compassion over profit. At 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and drove to the Columbus facility, needing to see the changes in person rather than filtered through data and reports. The maintenance bay was quiet at that hour, just a few mechanics working graveyard shift servicing vehicles that couldn't afford downtime during business hours. She walked through the upgraded space-proper ventilation, removing the thick smell of exhaust and chemicals that used to hang in the air, LED lighting that didn't give people headaches after 8 hours workstations designed for ergonomics rather than maximum density. One of the mechanics noticed her, a woman in her 30s named Rodriguez, who'd been with the company 6 years. "Can't sleep either." "Something like that. How's the new space treating you?" Rodriguez set down her wrench, wiping hands on a rag that was already thoroughly stained. "Honestly, it's weird. Good weird, but weird. Like someone actually thought about what would make the work better instead of just what would make the work faster." "Is it working? Are you able to do your job better? Ask me again in 3 months. Right now, everything is different, which means everything is slower while we figure out new systems. But yeah, I think once we adjust, this will be better. Being able to breathe properly is a pretty significant improvement." Diane thanked her and continued walking, finding herself in the driver's lounge that used to be a grim space where people killed time between runs. Now it was bright and clean, with actual comfortable seating and subsidized food that didn't come from machines designed to extract maximum profit. A driver was sleeping on one of the couches using a rolled-up jacket as a pillow, and Diane felt a rush of anger at herself for not noticing sooner how her company had failed basic obligations to human dignity. She drove back to Cleveland as dawn broke, traffic beginning to build on highways that never fully slept. By the time she reached her office, she'd made a decision that was either brave or foolish. Probably both. She called Eleanor Kemp, directly bypassing the usual channels that would have scheduled this conversation for some future date when it could be managed and controlled. "I need to address the board next week. Full presentation on pilot program status, including all the difficult data about production declines and cost overruns. I need them to see what we're building, rather than just what we're spending." Eleanor was silent for long enough that Diane wondered if the connection had failed. Then, "That's a bold move. The data doesn't tell a compelling story yet." "The data tells an honest story. And if the board is going to lose confidence in this direction, I'd rather face that directly than watch it erode through whispered concerns and sideline conversations." "All right, I'll schedule it, but Diane, go into this prepared for the possibility that honesty isn't enough. Sometimes people need comfort more than they need truth." The next week unfolded in a blur of preparation. Diane compiled every piece of data from the Columbus facility, good and bad, building a presentation that didn't hide costs or minimize disruption, but that contextualized short-term pain against long-term vision. She brought in testimonials from drivers and mechanics, survey data showing improved morale, customer feedback indicating marginal service improvements. Garrett spent Wednesday evening in her office reviewing the presentation, pushing her to make the human element more central than the financial justification. "You're still talking their language, returns on investment, projected timelines, efficiency metrics. But what changed your mind wasn't an ROI calculation. It was standing in that maintenance bay and seeing people work in conditions you wouldn't tolerate for yourself." The board responds to data, not feelings. The board responds to stories wrapped in data. Give them the numbers, but make them see actual people affected by actual choices. Otherwise, you're just debating abstractions, and abstractions are easy to dismiss when they're expensive. She revised the presentation based on his feedback, weaving in human stories that made costs concrete rather than theoretical. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear, one of those November days where winter announced its intention without fully committing. The board assembled at 9, all faces showing varying degrees of skepticism and concern. Diane took her position and launched directly into honest assessment. Production was down 17% at the pilot facility. Costs were running 23% over initial projections, and the timeline to break even had extended from 18 months to 24. She didn't minimize the numbers or excuse the overruns. She presented them as the price of fundamental transformation, the cost of choosing to be a different kind of company than they'd been for 22 years. Then she pivoted to changes that weren't captured in production metrics. Driver retention at Columbus had improved by 12% over 3 months. Not dramatic, but meaningful when each retained driver saved $8,000 to $12,000 in recruiting and training costs. Mechanics reported a 47% increase in job satisfaction. Customer complaints about damaged cargo had dropped by 19% in the Columbus region. 3 drivers from competing companies had specifically requested transfers to Columbus because word had spread about improved conditions. These numbers don't show up in quarterly reports. They don't affect stock price or impress analysts, but they represent something more sustainable than short-term efficiency gains extracted by treating people as disposable resources. They represent the foundation of a company that can survive not just next quarter, but the next decade. Blake's successor, Carol Brennan, promoted from regional management specifically because she'd advocated for employee welfare initiatives, added supporting evidence about retention economics and the hidden costs of high turnover that never appeared in simple production calculations. The presentation ran 45 minutes. When Diane finished, the room sat in silence that felt charged with competing reactions: approval, doubt, calculation, fear. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "This is ambitious and expensive and uncertain, but it's also honest, which is more than most turnaround strategies offer. I'm inclined to give it more time, but I need to know from other board members whether they're willing to stay committed through the difficult months ahead." Margaret Holloway was first to respond. "The data is concerning but not catastrophic. If we'd expected this to be easy or cheap, we wouldn't have voted for a $53 million outlay. I say we give it the 6 months originally projected before making judgment calls." 3 other members voiced agreement. 2 expressed deep reservations but grudging willingness to wait for more data. The final 2, both recruited during Blake's tenure, both skeptical from the start, abstained from supporting continued investment without clearer timelines for return. The meeting ended without formal vote, just tacit agreement to continue for now while maintaining close oversight of costs and progress. Diane left the boardroom exhausted but intact, her authority questioned but not revoked, her vision challenged but still viable. She called Garrett from her car, needing to hear a voice that wasn't worried about shareholder value or competitive positioning. "How did it go?" "I survived. The proposal is still alive. I have 6 months to prove this wasn't catastrophically stupid." "Then let's make sure it wasn't." His voice carried that unshakable certainty she'd come to depend on. "You've got people who want this to work. Use them. Build on what's starting to show improvement, and stop expecting transformation to be neat or quick or cheap." "When did you become an expert on corporate turnarounds?" "I'm not, but I am an expert on fixing things that seem impossible until you break them down into manageable problems. Your company isn't one big problem. It's 1,000 small problems that look overwhelming until you start solving them one at a time." After they hung up, Diane sat in her car and watched Cleveland move through its afternoon rhythms. People and vehicles and the constant motion of a city that never fully paused. She'd spent 22 years building toward a specific vision of success. And now she was trying to build towards something different. Not bigger necessarily, but better in ways that didn't show up in stock prices or quarterly reports. It was terrifying. It was necessary. It was the only way forward that didn't require her to keep pretending the life she'd built was the life she actually wanted.